Subcommittee will come to order. And pursuant to notice, the subcommittee meets this morning to mark up H.R. 1951, the Sean and David Goldman International Child Abduction Prevention and Return Act of 2013, H.R. 1897, the Vietnam Human Rights Act of 2013, and H.Res. 131 concerning the ongoing conflict in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and the need for international efforts toward long-term peace, stability, and observance of human rights. As our members are aware, these measures enjoy strong bipartisan support, and there are competing hearings and other events taking place this morning. Thus, as our members were informed earlier this week, it is the intent of the Chair to consider these measures en bloc, including the substitute amendment sent to you on Monday, offered by my good friend and colleague, Ms. Bass, and an amendment by Mr. Meadows sent to you on Tuesday. All members have copies of these documents before them, and then after we have concluded our expedited consideration, I will be glad to recognize any member, including myself and the ranking member, for any statements on the issues. All members are given leave to insert written remarks into the record should they choose to do so. Seeing that we have a reporting quorum present, without objection, the following measures are considered as read and will be considered en bloc. H.R. 1951, the Sean and David Goldman International Child Abduction Prevention and Return Act of 2013. The Meadows Amendment, number 4 to H.R. 1951, sent to members' offices on Tuesday. H.R. 1897, the Vietnam Human Rights Act of 2013. H.Res. 131, concerning the ongoing conflict in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and the need for international efforts towards long-term stability, peace, and observance of human rights. And the Bass Amendment, number 11, to H.Res. 131, sent to your offices on Monday. The Chair moves that the en bloc items be adopted. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. In the opinion of the chairs, and the items considered en bloc are adopted. Without objection, the measures as amended are reported favorably to the full committee. The staff is directed to make technical and conforming changes. I would note that now that we have completed our formal consideration of those measures, I will recognize members for remarks, and I recognize myself first on behalf of the first bill that was just passed on to the full committee. It was David Goldman's unrelenting effort to bring his son Sean home from Brazil that first alerted me to the epidemic of international parental child abduction in this country. According to the U.S. Department of State, between the years 2008 and 2012, bereaved, left-behind parents like David Goldman reported over 4,800 abduction cases involving more than 7,000 children. I had the privilege of joining David Goldman in his fight to return Sean and experienced firsthand the maddening obstacles encountered by left-behind parents, even in countries that have signed the Hague Convention on International Child Abductions, foreign courts, endless appeals to run out the clock, exploitation of the safeguards in the convention, and prejudice against foreigners. The damage to the child and the left-behind parents is incalculable and too often lifelong. The children are at risk of serious emotional and psychological problems and may experience anxiety, eating problems, nightmares, mood swings, sleep disturbances, aggressive behavior, resentment, guilt, and fearfulness. Parental child abduction is child abuse. These victims are American citizens who need the help of their government when normal legal processes are unavailable or fail. Too many families have been waiting too long for the return of their children. Our current system, with its endless delays and lack of proper accountability, has failed far too many. It is time for the approach that backs our demands for adherence to international obligations with some penalties and makes clear to foes and friends alike that our children are our top priority. As stated in the legislation, it has several purposes. First, we want to protect children whose habitual residence is the U.S. from the harmful effects of abduction and to assist left-behind parents to have access to their abducted children in a safe and predictable manner wherever the child is located while an abduction case is pending. We want to provide left-behind parents, their advocates, and judges the information they need to enhance the resolution of abduction cases and access cases through established legal procedures, the tools for assessing the risk of abduction and denial of rights of access, and the practical means for overcoming obstacles to recovering an abducted child. We seek to provide the necessary training for officials of the U.S. Armed Forces and the Department of Defense to establish policies and provide services to parents serving in our military that address the unique circumstances of abductions and violations of rights of access that may occur with regard to military-dependent children. An additional purpose of the bill would be to establish measured, effective, and predictable actions to be undertaken by the President on behalf of abducted American children, and to promote an international consensus that it is in the interest of children to have any issues related to their care and custody determined in the country of their habitual residence. And finally, the bill would encourage the effective implementation of international mechanisms, particularly those established pursuant to the Hague Abduction Convention, to achieve reciprocity in the resolution of abductions and to protect children from the harmful effects of abduction. The Goldman Act gives the President important tools to motivate other countries to quickly respond to applicants for abducted child's return. For even one case that has been pending for over 6 weeks in a foreign country's judicial system, the President may choose to at least issue a private démarche or take more serious actions commensurate with the gravity of the case. If a country has 10 or more cases of children abducted from the U.S. pursuant to this legislation, and those cases are not being resolved in a timely manner, or the entity responsible for working with the United States, U.S. Central Authority, the judiciary, or law enforcement, are persistently failing to fulfill their obligations, the President can take measured, effective, and predictable actions to aggressively advocate for our children's return. Actions range from denial of certain assistance to prohibiting the procurement of certain goods or services from the government, or the instrumentality response for the pattern of what we call non-cooperation. The President is required to request a consultation with any government concerned and report to Congress when contemplating serious actions. The President is also provided with certain waiver authorities that take into account the important national interests of the United States. However, the expectation is that the President will use all tools necessary to bring our children home in a timely manner, and that the President will have to explain the minority of cases where one of the 18 delineated tools or commensurate action cannot be used. I want to thank Mr. Meadows for his valuable amendment to the bill, which calls on the Government Accountability Office to report to Congress on Egypt's cooperation or facilitation of parental child abduction. Last week, the subcommittee heard compelling testimony of Mr. Colin Bauer, whose 2 boys were abducted to Egypt in 2009. Mr. Bauer indicated that Egypt has aided and abetted in the kidnapping and illegal holding of his sons, including by issuing false Egyptian passports for the 2 boys and by allowing them to exit the U.S. on Egyptian government-owned airline Egypt Air. It will be very helpful for members of Congress to receive an assessment from the GAO of the Egyptian government's involvement in this and the other cases of child abduction from the United States. I yield to my friend and colleague, Ms. Bass, for any comments you might have. Mr. Burr, Dr. Burr.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for convening this markup. I'm pleased that Foreign Affairs Committee and this subcommittee is proceeding with regular order as it moves legislation to the full committee. I want to focus for one moment on H.R. 1951, the Child Abduction and Return Act of 2013. I'm pleased that the subcommittee was able to focus on this important issue, and I support many of the provisions contained within the legislation. However, I believe the State Department has expressed some concerns in a possible unintended consequence of this bill. The punitive measures offered to the President under the legislation may discourage a non-party nation such as India from signing or ratifying the Hague Convention. As this legislation moves to full committee, I would like to have a better understanding of the non-signatories and what we can do to encourage their cooperation on this important issue. It's important that these countries join the Hague Convention. I would also like to work with my colleagues to address these concerns and ensure that any legislation we pass will have the desired effect of reducing the number of child abductions. Again, thank you, Chairman Smith, for continuing your important work in this area. Congratulations on moving your legislation through the subcommittee, and I look forward to working with you on this important issue. I yield back.
Dr. Barr, thank you very much. Chair recognizes Mr. Weber.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I don't have any comments at this time.
Okay, Mr. Meadows.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And obviously, this committee just acted to approve 3 pieces of timely and necessary legislation that will better the lives of thousands of people. And I'm proud that this committee has taken the initiative to address the ongoing humanitarian issues in Vietnam and in the Congo. And I want to commend the chairman and the ranking member for your leadership. The third bill we approved today, H.R. 1951, addresses the parental child abduction and the Hague Convention. This is a good bill. I'm proud to be a co-sponsor and proud to have supported it today. I'm also proud that we've been able to amend this bill to make it a little bit better. Last week, we heard powerful testimony on the foreign parental child abduction from parents of victims. And we heard that the foreign governments can often be complicit in these abductions, especially in non-Hague Treaty countries. And one of those witnesses was Colin Bauer. Mr. Bauer's 2 sons, Noor and Ramsey, were abducted and taken to Egypt in 2009. They remain there today with 20 other American children. Egypt is a country that we are working with and whose continued solvency depends on American aid and American intervention, and yet we hear heartbreaking stories like Mr. Bauer's. Thankfully, Mr. Bauer did not just share his story, but he shared recommendations on moving forward. And one of those recommendations was to require the GAO to report on the child abductions in Egypt, including the role of the Egyptian government. Today, I offer an amendment to H.R. 1951 to do exactly that, and I look forward to reading the GAO's eventual report. And I want to thank Mr. Bauer and all of those previous witnesses for sharing their stories, but I also want to thank the committee for supporting my amendment and moving this bill. And with that, I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Ms. Meadows, thank you very much, and thank you for authoring that very important amendment to this legislation. I'd recognize Mr. Stockman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your compassion that you've shown through all the years you've been here in Congress, and I appreciate that throughout the years you've stuck to it and when it have been easy to roll over to Ways and Means or some other important, quote-unquote, important committees, and that your compassion is demonstrated by these bills that you put forth. And I just want to say something quickly about our friends at DRC. I've been there many times, and they have a great potential. This nation's larger than Europe, Western Europe, and they have great potential if they adhere to civil society and they stick to the rule of law and let democracy flourish. And I think this bill is going to go a long ways in ensuring that the DRC will be successful in achieving its goals, and I really appreciate you offering this bill. And I hope when it gets to the full committee that they realize the work and effort that you have put into these bills. But I just wanted to point out that DRC has a great opportunity to take advantage of and work cooperatively with the United States, and look forward to future hearings and testimony. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stockman. I yield to Ms. Bass to speak on H.Res. 131.
Chairman Smith, again, thank you for holding today's markup. I'm delighted that we've worked in a bipartisan manner to pass today's legislation, and did want to speak for a minute on H.R. 131 concerning the ongoing conflict in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and the need for international efforts toward long-term peace, stability, and the observance of human rights. As you're well aware, in the DRC, an estimated 5 million people, which is just an incredible number, have died, and some 2 million have been displaced due to repeated cycles of war, conflict, violence, particularly sexual and gender-based violence waged against women and children. It's time for this crisis to come to an end. Today's markup takes an important step forward in efforts to raise awareness within the U.S. Congress and among all Americans of this horrific and tragic crisis. I was recently in the Congo and heard from many people there, and I've heard from the Congolese diaspora here in the United States about the situation in the Congo. Currently, we have 55 members of the House from both parties that have co-sponsored this bill, and I plan to continue to call for bipartisan support for this legislation. It's also my understanding that efforts are underway to introduce similar legislation in the Senate. Lastly, there's been a great deal of discussion around the need for a special envoy to the DRC and the Great Lakes region. This legislation calls for such an envoy, and Secretary Kerry, in testimony before both the House and the Senate, has indicated his plan to make an appointment. I'm pleased that this effort is making progress and urge the Secretary to move swiftly to make his decision and develop a comprehensive strategy that relies on diplomacy and engagement to address the complex set of issues that stand as barriers to peace and stability in the DRC and the region. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
I want to thank, yield myself this time as I may consume. I want to thank the Ranking Member Karen Bass for introducing this important resolution, and I am very pleased to be original co-sponsor, and it's supported, I know, by members of this subcommittee. This measure brings attention to the continuing deplorable situation in the DRC, in which more than 24 militias, as well as the National Army itself, continue to terrorize the country's population. The international community has been outraged by the staggering rate of sexual violence, with reports of nearly 50 women and girls being raped each hour in the DRC. The atrocities also include the recruitment and physical and psychological torture of child soldiers. Res 131 calls on the nations of Africa's Great Lakes region, including the DRC government itself, to take all necessary actions to live up to international law and their own agreements concerning non-interference in one another's affairs. As we found out through several UN investigations in our own subcommittee's 3 hearings last year, this has not always been the case. Unregulated cross-border militia activity and the plundering of natural resources in the DRC have made life for so many Congolese, especially those in eastern Congo, all but unbearable. The trade in illicit minerals and poached ivory has also served to fuel the conflict in the DRC. The Atrocities Prevention Board, created in 2011 to coordinate U.S. policy to prevent mass atrocities and serious human rights violations, is called upon by Res 131 to work with regional and international partners to bring the tragedy of life in eastern Congo to a definitive end. The Atrocities Prevention Board is directed to, quote, address, prevent, and ensure accountability for serious violations of humanitarian law and human rights abuses by all actors in the DRC. While its neighbors share the blame for the international crisis that exists in the Great Lakes, Res 131 also calls on the government of the DRC to investigate and prosecute its own military forces and citizens responsible for human rights abuses, and to proceed with democratic and security sector reforms, which it has previously agreed to. Anyone else like to be heard of this? Okay, I'd like to now recognize myself to speak briefly on H.R. 1897, and I do want to thank my colleagues for their support of the Vietnam Human Rights Act of 2013. The subcommittee, as we all know, heard from witnesses at a hearing on April 11th that the Vietnamese government continues to violate a broad array of fundamental human rights. The testimony we heard confirmed that religious, political, and ethnic persecution continue, and that Vietnamese officials are complicit in human trafficking. At that hearing just over a month ago, we heard from a sister of a Vietnamese woman who was forced to work in a brothel in Russia with 14 other Vietnamese women. At another hearing last year, we heard about a group of Vietnamese workers who were trafficked to Jordan. In each of these cases, not only did officials from the Vietnamese government fail to help the victims, but they actually cooperated with the traffickers to keep the trafficking operations going. I am pleased to report that following the April hearing and the sisters' courageous testimony, the Vietnamese trafficking victims who were being held in Russia have been freed. But the Vietnamese government must respect the human rights of all of its people, not only those who are fortunate enough to have their human rights violations publicized at a congressional hearing. For this reason, I've reintroduced the Vietnam Human Rights Act of 2013, and glad that the subcommittee voted it out today. The purpose of H.R. 1897 is to promote the development of freedom and democracy in Vietnam. It seeks to do so primarily by stipulating that the United States can increase its non-humanitarian assistance to Vietnam above the 2000 fiscal year levels only when the President is able to certify to Congress that the government of Vietnam has made substantial progress, operative words, substantial progress in establishing a democracy and promoting human rights, including respecting freedom of religion and releasing all religious prisoners, respecting rights of freedom of expression, assembly, and association, and releasing all political prisoners, independent journalists, and labor activists, repealing and revising laws that criminalize peaceful dissent, independent media, unsanctioned religious activity, and nonviolent demonstrations in accordance with international human rights standards, respecting the human rights of members of all ethnic groups, and then taking all appropriate steps, including prosecution of government officials, to end any government complicity in human trafficking. This condition is on increased non-humanitarian assistance may be waived in the national interest of the United States if any such increase is offset by assistance to increased training on Vietnam's international human rights obligations, to support non-commercial rule of law programming, or to support measures to overcome the Vietnamese government's jamming of Radio Free Asia. H.R. 1897 also includes several senses of Congress. Vietnam has announced that it is seeking membership in the UN Human Rights Council, a vote that will be held at this fall's UN General Assembly. Given the Vietnamese government's abysmal human rights record, the bill calls on the Secretary of State to strongly oppose Vietnam's candidacy. The bill also indicates that Vietnam should be redesignated a country of particular concern for religious freedom, pursuant to the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, and that its tier ranking, pursuant to the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, should reflect the fact that the government is not making significant efforts to eliminate human trafficking. Again, I want to thank my colleagues for their support. Yield to any member. Yes, yes, Mr. Meadows.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for your comments and for highlighting this issue. And I've been in some of these hearings as we've heard the just riveting testimony from so many of the affected families. And time and time again, the recommendation was that we put forth meaningful legislation that does not just talk about our support for human rights, but really make sure that it is measurable and that it has consequences. I'm hopeful that we will see speedy action on this particular piece of legislation. I was unaware of many of the unbelievable atrocities that were happening until we heard testimony in this very room, and I want to thank the chairman for highlighting it, but also putting forth this piece of legislation that I hope will see an end to some of the unbelievable atrocities that are occurring, specifically to have an appointment of a country with the known violations that we have to the Human Rights Committee on Human Rights would be very problematic and would send the wrong message. So I agree and concur and would encourage the Secretary to oppose that until we see significant responses on behalf of the Vietnam government. With that, I yield back, thanking the chairman.
Any other members wishing to be heard? If not, I do want to thank my distinguished colleagues for their participation and support for these bills, and on both sides of the aisle. Thank you. And without this markup is concluded, and we are finished.